Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Way Out Stories, Volume 1, Story 1, A Haunted Cowboy. The Old West has its share of ghostly lore no matter what section of the country you study, and Nebraska is no exception. By 1896, most of the territorial fighting had calmed down in western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. The open prairies were used for grazing by large cattle ranches. This required the cows to be tended. So was introduced that colorful icon of the 19th century, the cowboy. A story comes out of the Hemingford area back in 1896 involving a cowboy named Joe Healy, who had been hired by the Carlisle Cattle Company in Wyoming to help drive cattle and horse herds. On one particular evening, he had been transferring horses from a ranch on the Sweetwater to another place many miles from the origin. His drive brought him across the border, where he passed the herd near some of the famous landmarks of western Nebraska. As night settled, Healy stopped the herd to rest. Before things could get settled, the herd became excited and prepared to stampede. The experienced cowboy spotted the object whipping up intensity among the horses. The figure of a man, pure white in color and somewhat iridescent, floated across the trail ahead of them. Through his fear, Healy described the figure as clearly defined, but he was unable to describe what the apparition was wearing. After the shock of the moment had passed, Joe Healy moved the horses into a corral a mile's distance from the border. Once they were secured, he headed back to the location of the apparition. Returning to the general spot he had been earlier, Joe found the animated object he called a goblin damned, still visible, leaping about like a firefly. He quickly concocted a plan. From his horse, he would charge at the object, using his herding skills to force the ghost into a solid backing. Joe then planned on lassoing the ghost with his rope. Despite exhausting his horse and emptying his six-shooter into the ghost, Joe Healy was unsuccessful in his attempt to capture or injure the specter. Since that time, others had reported seeing similar figures. Story number 2. I'm a current serving police officer and joined the local force in 1975. Sometime shortly after that time, I was on a night duty, working with another officer who was responsible for basically showing me the ropes. We were in the police canteen sometime around 1:30 a.m. when we received a call to go to a disturbance some 1 mile from the station. En route to the disturbance, we were flagged down by a man who was very large in build. He really looked as though he could handle himself. He was obviously very distressed and begged us to go to a nearby house. I can remember this man was driving an old VW Beetle. I seem to remember that he was dressed only in underclothing and possibly wearing a dressing gown. We tried to tell the man that we were on our way to a disturbance, but his needs appeared to be greater. He took us to a house nearby and was saying something to the effect that something strange had happened to his daughter. The story continues that this man had been a former serving soldier in Northern Ireland and had just left the services and settled into this house with his wife. I seem to remember that his brother-in-law was also staying at the house. He stated that he had a large Alsatian dog also in the house. The man stated that all three had been out for a drink that evening and had left a babysitter in charge of his daughter, who was just a babe in arms. The adults had returned to the house about midnight, took the babysitter home, and returned. They were watching a program on the TV called The Baron when they heard something being dragged across the bedroom floor directly above them. No carpets were on the floor, and the baby's cot was in this room. Then they heard the sound of the baby crying. The man's wife started to panic, thinking someone had broken in and was taking the baby. The husband tried to open the door from the main room to the hall, thus giving him access to the stairs, then to the bedrooms. They could not open this door. Someone had grabbed hold of a small axe from a downstairs room to try and get the door open. The male told me that he then heard footsteps coming downstairs, the baby still crying, and a female voice saying something similar to, "Hush, don't cry." The adults tried to open the door and eventually managed to force it open. They got the dog and threw the dog into the hallway, thinking that it would attack the person whom they thought had broken into the house. The dog bit its owner on the hand and ran out through the front door into the street. Both males went upstairs and saw that the cot was in the middle of the floor with a baby still in it but awake. They grabbed the baby, left the house, I think in 2 cars. The husband in one and his brother-in-law, wife, and child in the other. This is when the male in the VW came across us traveling to the disturbance. I entered the house and saw the door badly damaged as he had stated. There were a number of bottles of empty beer on the table, but I didn't think this man was drunk. I searched upstairs and sure enough the cot was in the middle of the room. My colleague searched downstairs. No sign of a forced entry. We were in the divisional van, a Ford Transit, which was parked with its offside or the driver's side to this house, which was situated in a small cul-de-sac. My colleague turned the van around so that its near side or passenger side was now opposite the house. As I was taking the man's details in my pocketbook, I asked him if he had fully secured the house. He said yes, apart from a small downstairs window measuring some 3 feet by 18 inches. I walked down the path and released the stay from the outside, allowing the window to close. Returned to the man and he gave me an address of a relative nearby that he was staying with. As we were about to leave, I looked up at the bedroom window that had contained the cot, saw the curtain move, and the face of an elderly lady appeared. She was wearing glasses and had her hair tied up in a bun on top of her head. I looked at her for some 10 seconds, as did the male. He became very frightened, got in his car, and drove away. This is the only thing that had really happened to me in 23 years as a police officer. I felt very nervous about it. The house is still standing to this day and is in the northwest of the UK. Next story. I'd like to share some of my experience I had when I was stationed at Camp Zama, Japan from 1987 to 1994. I lived at Sagamihara Housing Base and worked at 69th Finance at Camp Zama. Before I tell you the scary stuff, I will start with the slightly weird. Several times while I worked by myself, I would get the feeling I was not alone, but not being able to see anyone or anything. I would just think to myself that I was just imagining, and would finish my work and get out of the building as soon as possible. On several occasions, I did see someone walk by the open door, and thinking that it was my assistant who came in early like me, I would wonder why he didn't come in. Each time I got up to investigate, there would be no one in the building. There was no way anyone could get out of the building unseen, because they would have to walk back past my door. This never really scared me at the time, but I always wondered how they did it and who it was. It wasn't until about 1992 that I heard about the history of others seeing apparitions of sorts. So I'm sure it wasn't just my overactive imagination. The only time I was ever really scared was when I was at home. I had to quit sleeping in my bedroom because of all the terrifying activity going on day and night. I was seriously thinking about getting psychiatric help, but I kept telling myself if it wasn't real, and since I knew it wasn't real, I probably wasn't too far gone. I didn't know how many times I was awakened from a sound sleep because I could feel something sit down on my bed. I had a water bed, and I could actually see the imprint of something sitting there. And the mattress would move, and the water would slosh, and I would be up and out of there. It didn't happen every night, and even though I knew what I saw, I didn't let it go get to me until I started waking up to some type of entity physically on top of me. It was so horrible. I can't even say what it was doing to me. I wouldn't be able to move or speak until it was done with me. I kept telling myself if it had to be in a dream, even though I know I was awake. I read everything I could find on this subject, and most people say it could all be a dream. I read a book entitled The Entity, and this was the exact phenomena that I experienced. I suffered in silence for a long time because I just couldn't believe it was real. Until now, I've only told 2 people, my best friend and her son who is a minister. He told me that the next time it happened, that I should pray to God for help and to tell the spirit in the name of God leave and never return. I did just that, and after doing this several times, it finally stopped. Even though I couldn't speak, I just thought these words as hard as I could. I've experienced quite a few strange occurrences in my life, but nothing is so physical and invading as what I experienced while I was in Japan. Since then, I've read quite a bit on the subject of ghosts and have come to the conclusion that I had inadvertently invited my unfriendly visitor by playing with Ouija boards when I was a teenager. I still sometimes wonder if I'm crazy, but I swear, what I experienced seemed too real for it all to be just a bad dream. Next story. I was a military wife living on a Marine base in Okinawa, Japan. We lived in our apartment for about 2.5 years and experienced a few weird things. It began with the also common door slamming and opening, and moved to something more real. My husband is a skeptic. I have to see it to believe it kind of person. Well, we heard something together one night that we can't explain. I put our 3 small kids to bed and shut all the bedroom doors and the door to the living area. Our living area couch faced away from that door. My husband and I were sitting there watching a movie when about 15 minutes later we heard the doorknob rattle and the door open. Then we heard our 3.5-year-old daughter timidly call out, "Mommy?" Well, I tossed my hands up in the air and proceeded to scold her for getting out of bed. I turned to find the doorway empty. So I got up expecting to find her behind the door or scurrying down the hallway, but instead found an empty hallway and all the doors shut. So I checked her room to find her snoozing heavily, tucked into her bed, as were the other 2 children. Seriously confused, I walked into the living area to ask my husband if he just heard something. He asked, "What? You mean Lisa calling your name?" Neither one of us knew what to make of that. After that, on occasion I would see the reflection of something moving behind me in the steel cabinet in my kitchen. I would turn around expecting to find my husband or one of the kids, but instead found nothing. I would hear my daughter calling, "Mommy," from a few feet away when she wasn't even in the room or in the apartment. The strangest experience was when my husband and I were watching Letterman, and from across the room, 20 feet, I could see what appeared to be a shadow standing in the middle of the floor. It was a little girl swinging her arms back and forth. It lasted about 4 to 5 seconds. I was so shocked I couldn't move or say anything to bring my husband's attention to it. Then he noticed my fright and started asking me what it was. Right as he started to look in the direction of the girl, the shadow seemed to just jump up into a cloud mass and back down into the lamp. I have seen a very brief glimpse of a child in a wall mirror that is positioned at eye level for me. Just one weekend at a USO on a different base, as I filled soda cups for all of us, a little girl appeared to run very quickly behind me. I assumed it was my daughter Lisa. So I looked around the corner to find her sitting with a family. I went back to the soda machine, and it happened twice more. I don't know what to make of it. Was it a ghost? Was it a projection of my daughter's spirit? She does have a strong personality. I just don't know. I didn't ever get any evil feelings from it, whatever, but it was strange nonetheless. Next story. Whenever I would hear of someone living in a haunted house, I always thought the house had to be at least 100 years old and very run down. I know better than that now. In the 70s, my husband and I moved into a nice little house in a small Tennessee town. For about the first 6 months, it was our dream house. But then strange things started to happen. When we were in the kitchen, the TV in the living room would change channels. Sometimes the knobs would fly off the TV and land on the floor on the other side of the room. When we were in the living room, we would sometimes hear the kitchen cabinet doors open and close. Every time we were in the bathroom and sat down on the toilet, the light would go out. Stand up and the light would come back on. That was the only comical thing about that house. Things started to disappear around the house. At first we thought that maybe a neighborhood kid were breaking into our house when we were gone. My husband nailed the windows shut from the inside. That seemed to solve our problem for a little while. About 3 weeks later, we took the kids and spent the day with their grandmother. When we returned later that day, what we saw was really horrible. Everything we owned, food, clothes, furniture, toys, everything, was in a pile in our living room floor. Our windows were still nailed from the inside, and the doors were locked. That night my husband woke me up in the middle of the night. Standing at the foot of our bed was what looked like a little old woman in a white nightgown. She vanished a second or two later. The next day we did some research into the house. We discovered that the last owner had died in the room where we sleep. We put the house back on the market a short time later and moved to another town. 1 week later, our dream house burnt to the ground due to faulty wiring. I will always believe that she ran us away to save our lives, and I thanked her. Next story. In 1992, I moved to a Civil War era row house in Richmond, Virginia. I knew from the beginning that something was unusual about the place. My roommates and I would always feel a presence, like something watching us. It took us about a year or so to find out what it was. One night, my roommate Josh and I were sitting in our kitchen/den. My attention kept being drawn to the corner of the room by the back door. Josh was sitting by the back door and turned to see what I was looking at, and did a double take. Even though I couldn't see anything, he swore that he did. He couldn't describe it, but there was definitely something there. Over the period of the next week, I tried to contact whatever was in our house. This is not new or unusual for me. I've been talking to spirits for about 15 years before that. The spirit began to appear to me as well. At first, it was just shapeless mist, but gradually took on the form of a teenage girl, dressed in Civil War period clothing. When I spoke to her, she was relieved, as I was. Her name was Angela, and no one had spoken to her in about 20 years. The last people to inhabit our house were totally unaware of her presence. She had died in the house when she was 16, but wouldn't tell me how or why she didn't travel onto the other side. She and I grew very attached to each other. We talked often and watched TV together. Sometimes she would even lie in bed with me while I slept. The thing she liked to do the most was read. Of course, having no physical arms, she could hold a book or turn the pages. So I would ask her what type of things she wanted to read and then go out and get those types of books. Then we would read them together, her reading over my shoulder. After a while, my financial got pretty bad. I ended up having to move out of the house. Angela and I were both very saddened by this. I offered to try and find some way to take her with me, but she said that she had to stay there. Eventually, I had to leave Richmond altogether. Now, often at night, I will think about her and allow my awareness to drift back to the old row house where I used to live. I can feel that she's still there, and I know that she can still feel me as well. We smile at each other across the miles. I hope that she accomplishes whatever it is that she feels she has to do before moving on to the other side. And I hope that when I take the journey that she is there waiting for me. Next story. It was the winter of 1995 and I worked at a youth home that was over 100 years old. It was during Christmas vacation. Most of the kids had gone to their families or had stayed with friends, and only 8 were at this large home. Late at night, I walked down a dark hallway, making sure all the kids were in bed. At the end of the hall was a large mirror. Looking down this hall, I could see myself and the hall behind me. I also saw an old woman dressed in white. She had no expression on her face, but we made eye contact through the mirror. Without turning my head, I called out, asking why she was upstairs. I thought she might be a staff member, though there were only 2 other staff members and neither of them looked anything like her. The woman slowly turned away and started walking. I whipped my head around and saw no one. I then jogged down the hall and rounded the corner and still saw no one. At that moment, I felt very uncomfortable, as though I was in someone else's house without their permission. I left the area shaking and went to speak with the other staff members. Keep in mind that there were no kids at that side of the house. After speaking with several staff members in confidence over the next couple of months, I uncovered that most of them had seen this same woman in white. One staff member stated that she felt a hand grab her shoulder, but she didn't see anyone, nor was anyone home at the time. Another staff member, my supervisor, heard his name called loudly. He ran down the stairs and saw a smoky apparition of a woman in white just before he ran through her. He said he felt a bone-chilling cold and experienced a sense of terror, but thought the feeling was from the ghost, not from him. At noon, while the kids were at school, 3 staff members witnessed a woman in white walk by the door of the main office. Since the doors were locked and no one was home, they had thought someone broke in. When the staff members went out to talk to the woman, no one was there. Several of the kids At our house, they reported seeing a woman as well as a few other people. One girl, who was very stable and never cried, was screaming. When I had gone in to see what was wrong, she said a woman walked into her room and smiled at her. This same story was told by several of the girls. Since this place houses young girls, the staff felt it best to vehemently deny any stories about ghosts. In at least one case, a staff member was fired due to his inability to keep this fact a secret. After researching this house, I found that it had once been privately owned by a family who had been murdered in the house. This is a true story from Newburyport, Massachusetts. Next story. There's more than one corn in Indiana, or at least from my experience. There's a few ghostly hauntings to visit you along the way. My first experience with ghostly guests was when I was about 7 years old or so. We lived in a small house in Mishawaka near the old Grand Trunk Railroad that crosses through our two cities, South Bend being the other one. One summer night, I was lying awake in bed, looking out my window into the darkness, dreaming boyhood things that typical 7-year-old dream about when, all of a sudden, this dark, faceless shadow figure looked in on me from the window, holding what looked to be a lantern that emanated a scary glowing light that did not cast about the house or the figure, but stayed within its lantern shape. Terrified of this visitor that watched me from the window, I darted out of my room screaming for my mom and dad, which slept in the room next door. My father went outside to investigate and found no footprints at the window, and the dog outside was calm. It rained earlier, and my mother had a garden around the foot of the house, in the back and side with fresh dirt, so there should have been something. Of course, my parents dismissed me and let me sleep on the couch that night, for I was too terrified to go back to that bedroom. The next morning, I went about my daily ritual of bothering the next door neighbor lady, which was one of the older senior citizens who the block kids liked to hang around with, and I told her about my visitor. As I described what I saw, her face became pale. She told me that 20 years ago her husband worked for the railroad as a switchman, and it was just down the path a little ways from the house. At the tracks that very night he met his death from a train while walking home along the tracks from work late at night. My parents were a transient type of family, so we ended up in various places during the 12 years I lived with them. We moved to Plymouth, Indiana for a while when I was about 10 years old. One day, while walking down the street with the neighborhood kids on my way to my first day at school, we passed a boarded up house, which a group of the kids told me was haunted. They told me a few years prior a young single woman was brutally raped and murdered in that house, and ever since everyone was scared of going in it. Being the inquisitive type that I was, I took it upon myself to prove those scaredy cats wrong and go explore the house myself. I took my trusted dog with me one day over to the house, and I entered the doorway. My dog's hair raised on his back, and he ran. Thinking nothing about his odd behavior, I continued into the house. I explored the house from room to room for a while, and nothing happened. Then, while standing in the dining room, looking around, a very cold chill overcame me, and I felt something ice cold grab my arm and hold it tight for a few seconds. I was scared out of my wits and ran home as fast as I could. I felt a burning sensation on my arm where it was held by that chilling hand, and discovered a bright red mark on my arm the shape of slender fingers. To this day, I still have a scar on my arm in place of that mark that outlines a finger, and since that day I've become oddly sensitive of apparitions, and in most cases they tell me who they are and why they are there. Then, at around 11 years of age, I was living in a foster home, and while our foster parents were away one night, my foster sister and brother and I got bored and broke out the Ouija. We were playing with it for a while when all of a sudden this horrible pig-like demon thing started scratching at our living room window, and the pointer on the board was going nuts. Of course, we swore off the Ouija board ever since. Maybe this has something to do with the previous encounter. I'm not sure, but this next story is. All my other encounters with spiritual sights from that day on until I was 25 was more of a sensing than of an actual visit. But one night I was visiting a girlfriend and her friend's house up in the woody neighborhood area of the Notre Dame campus. I told the girls I had to use a tree and would be right back, and proceeded to the woody section next to her house. I entered the section and saw this ghostly woman about 20 some years old standing there crying, and I asked her why. She told me her name was Mary Milner, and she was raped and murdered in 1971 at that spot while on her way to class. She wanted to see her mother in Philadelphia, but did not know how to get home. We must have had that ghostly conversation for a spell because the girls were calling for me and throwing their usual insults and stuff. I walked out of the cluster, and they said that I was white as a ghost. I usually am after an encounter. They seemed to take a lot out of me. I was chilled to the bone. I told Susie, my girlfriend's friend, about what I saw and what the woman told me, and Susie said, without a doubt, that situation occurred. Next story. When I was in high school in 1976, I was in a terrible car accident. The funny thing is, right before the car I was riding in struck the telephone pole, I jumped into the back seat and went immediately to sleep. I would have been decapitated as the force of the hit caused the hood of the Buick to come to a point and pierce the seat where I had been sitting. I remember waking up, and although I was in shock, I can remember seeing the other two people that were in the car as well. I remember looking out the window, and there was a figure leaning in towards me. I know it was a man. However, he was luminant and looking at me. I can recall a sense of friendliness and knew everything would be all right. After 4 years of pain that followed that tragic night, I was sleeping in my room in my parents' house when I rolled over to my right side, and there was the same figure. He was sitting beside my bed watching me. For an instant, I froze, then swiped off the covers and ran to my parents' room. As I was waking my mother up, I remembered the night of the accident and this one presence that was with me that night and realized it was the same spirit. My mother, being the good Catholic mother that she is, told me it was my guardian angel coming to tell me everything would be all right. I often wished that I did not run from that room that night, as I missed an opportunity to try to communicate with him. Years passed and I was traveling home from work on one Saturday afternoon. The exit from my home was a two-lane exit to the left, and I was in the right-hand lane. There was a little traffic, if any, that day. As I was about a mile from my exit, I felt the presence of the spirit again, and he told me that the big brown van barreling up the left-hand lane was going to cut me off. As the two-lane exit approached, and I would normally just go with the road, I let up on the gas, slowed down gently, and sure enough, the van cut me off. I would have been killed. I was totally calm, anticipating this to happen. And then he was gone. I often think about the spirit or angel that I have, and maybe one day I will have the opportunity to thank him. Next story. In 1983, after I got married, my wife and I bought a house. It wasn't an old house. It was only 7 years old at the time. We bought the house located in West Kentucky from an aging couple. She had terminal lung cancer and wanted to spend her last years up north with her children and friends. The old man loved the house and area. I only met him a couple of times, but he told me he hated to leave. Now, both of these people were heavy smokers, and we had a lot of work ahead of us for such a recently built home: paint, carpet, wallpaper, etc. And I spent the first year pouring our heart out into this home. My wife is always spooky and doesn't like being alone and won't answer the door if she's home alone. So I keep a handgun stored away and always check out rooms and noises, for it's become commonplace. Well, after 3 years of not ever having anything occur other than maybe some neighborhood cats making noises at night, I came home from work one day to an empty house. I walked into the den, and I definitely saw a man dressed in overalls walk into our bedroom. I got my revolver from its hiding spot and checked it to make sure it was loaded and proceeded into the bedroom. When I arrived, no one was there, with no way out of the back of the house except passing me. I searched everywhere, under beds, windows, which, by the way, were locked, closets, nothing. I quickly chalked this up to imagination, though I have never had it happen to me before, and the last thing I was going to do was tell my skittish wife. So, about a week or so later, I woke in the middle of the night and saw the same figure standing in a corner of the room. I didn't feel scared or threatened. I rubbed my eyes and he was still there. The corner was empty, but it was as he were there in front of the desk or the dresser doing something. I finally decided to wake my wife, and when she finally arose groggy from her sleep, he was gone. Of course, I didn't tell her what I had seen, otherwise we would have been moving the next day. 10 days or so passed, and I was working out in the yard, and a neighbor that walks in the subdivision stopped to chat and said, "Well, Mr. Brown finally passed away." I said, "Who's Mr. Brown?" She replied, "He's a sweet old man you bought your house from, the one that always wore overalls every day of his life. I talked to him just a few months ago after his wife passed away and told him how nice you and your wife had fixed up the house and were taking great care of it. She said that he missed it so bad, and now that his wife was gone, he wished more than anything that he was back here. He loved it here." Well, I didn't tell her of seeing him come to make his last rounds, and I never saw Mr. Brown again. I was a skeptic before, and I sometimes still find stories hard to believe. But this I saw with my own eyes, and I'm glad that I was able to explain what once was unexplainable.